Today we go sightseeing in the Great Smoky Mountains. Driving towards Cades Cove, we stopped at some panoramic spots that take your breath away. The rivers with ice-cold waters were amazing, things we don't get to see every day. The Great Smoky Mountain National Park is a 800 square mile mountain wilderness that is federally owned and managed by the National Park Service. It protects the largest swatch of upland forest east of the Mississippi. It is surrounded by over 1.6 million acres of U.S. Forest Service National Forest. Lands which provide Great Smoky Mountain visitors with breathtaking views of row after row of mountains and ridges stretching to the horizon with only the most scattered evidence of human development. A rare sight in the heavily populated eastern U.S. The Great Smoky Mountains Park is America's most visited national park with more than 9 million visitors a year, roughly triple the number that come to Yellowstone or Yosemite national parks. These visitors are drawn by sweeping mountain views, 730 miles of pristine mountain streams, carpets of wildflowers, and a lush of forest that lead to the park's recognition as an international biosphere reserve. It is home to abundant wildlife including black bears, elk, white-tailed deer, and 200 species of birds. There are so many great spots to stop and enjoy the nature of this place, we almost forgot our original intended destination. Welcome to Cades Cove, a flat valley between mountains and ridges that showcase for some of the most inspiring natural and cultural treasures that the Southern Appalachian Mountains have to offer. The primary access to Cades Cove is the 11-mile one-way Cades Cove Loop Road. A $1 booklet can be purchased at the beginning of the Loop Road by the Information Center. It provides not only a map with all the stops, but much more about the history, people, and animals that have called the Cove home. While driving, look out for some horses, deer, bear, turkeys, and much more. If you're driving this narrow road, be sure to watch for bicyclists and pedestrians along the way. If you wish to stop and observe wildlife, please use one of the roadside pullouts so as not to block traffic. Our first stop is John Oliver's place. John Oliver bought this land in 1826. It remained in the family until the park was established more than 100 years later. This is one of the 80 historic buildings in the park, and also one of the original structures. A fireplace was one of the most important things in a cabin, to cook and to keep the house warm. Large families often lived in such small buildings. Exact arrangements differed from family to family. Usually, parents, infants, and daughters slept in the first floor and sons slept in the loft. Not much except mules, muscles, simple tools, and neighborly help was needed to fell the trees, get them to the building site, and build the house. The round logs were scored along with length with a felling axe, then hewn with a broad axe. The notched corners need no nails or pegs. Gravity holds them together. Open spaces between logs were filled with mud to seal out wind, snow, and rain. The stone chimney is held together with mud mortar. Our next stop is the Primitive Baptist Church. Some of the earliest settlers established the church in 1827. A log building served their needs until this one replaced it in 1887. The church closed during the Civil War. An official church correspondence after the war explained it in this way. We, the Primitive Baptist Church in Blount County in Cades Cove, do show the public why we have not kept up our church meeting. It was an account of the rebellion, and we was Union people, and the rebels was too strong here in Cades Cove. Our preacher was obliged to leave. It was strange why a preacher would leave. Anyway, they resumed service right after the war ceased. Some of the early settlers lie in the church cemetery. The next stop is the Methodist Church. The story goes that a J.D. McCampbell, a blacksmith and carpenter, built this church in 115 days for $115, and he later served many years as its minister. Methodists were not as numerous as Baptists in the Cove, but enough of them got together in the 1820s to establish the church in a log building that lasted until this one replaced it in 1902. Notice that the church has two front doors. This usually indicates the church follows the custom of men sitting on one side of the house and women on the other, but this church didn't follow that custom. The two doors are there because the church borrowed the building plans of another church that did divide its congregations by gender. As all the churches of that era, it has a cemetery with graves that date back in the 1800s. Next is the Missionary Baptist Church. Yep, another Baptist church. A group of Baptists expelled from the Primitive Baptist Church because they favored missionary work formed this church in 1839. The church ceased to meet during the Civil War like the rest of them. It resumed activity after the war, but without members who had been Confederate sympathizers. This building dates from 1915. There was also a Sunday school that started in the church in 1898, continued until the church closed in 1944. The next stop is Elijah Oliver Place. Recognize that name, Oliver. He was the son of John Oliver, whose cabin you saw earlier. Was born in the Cove in 1824. After he married, he and his family moved out of the Cove before the Civil War. After the war, he bought this property and moved back in. In the time and place of this family, more buildings were required to live than now. With no refrigeration or freezer, they needed the spring house to keep milk and butter cool. They needed the smokehouse to store and preserve hams, shoulders, and side meat for an entire year. They ate mostly pork because it was easier to preserve than other meats. They needed the corn crib to store enough corn for grinding into meal to last until the next harvest. They needed horses or mules to pull plows, arrows, buggies, sleds, and wagons. And they needed a barn to shelter these animals along with the cow that provided milk. Hay to feed them was stored in a barn loft. Water for drinking, cooking, bathing, and laundry had to be carried from the spring. No easy task. Buildings were of log construction until the 1870s because there was no nearby sawmill to saw logs into lumber. Our next stop is Cable Mills area. It's a collection of historic buildings, barns, homes, a smokehouse, a blacksmith shop that are scattered all around the original mill, making this spot a worthy stop. You can stop at the visitor center here for a souvenir bag of flour from the grist mill, history books, or anything else. Starting from the visitor center, your first stop will be the blacksmith shop. Iron was an essential in the Cove and in all of rural America in the 18th and early 19th centuries, and the blacksmith was its master. Every farm community had a blacksmith, and some large farms had their own. This is what they call a LaQuire cantilever barn. The overhang in a cantilever barn such as this one provided shelter for animals as well as storage space for the farm equipment. Cantilever construction, meaning counterweighted overhanging beams, originated centuries ago in Europe. These large barns were common in the Cove, where farmers needed shelter in the cold months for the livestock they grazed in the mountains during the warm season. With one of these sized barns, you can store anything in here, from farm equipment to chopped wood and hay bales, or just hay. Back in those days, they didn't have the luxury of a baler. You got wood storage for tools and material. Really nice. Upstream from this river next to the barn, you can visit the water gate and dam that sends water down this long mill race and eventually into the mill wheel. The mill is still working, and visitors can stop in and sample or purchase cornmeal and flour as the ancestors once did. John Gable built this water-powered gristmill and sawmill around 1870. The same wheel provided power for both mills. Few log homes were built after the advent of sawmills, and some existing ones were modified with sawed lumber. There's an operator here every day that tells the stories and shows how everything works by throwing some corn in there. Shows how the stone grinds it down and it comes out the other side as meal. Real cool. Today, Great Smoky Mountains Association operates Cable Mill as an historical exhibit. The smokehouse was where large sections of hogs were cured by smoking or salting and stored for use until the next hog killing. If you wanted ham for breakfast, you just carry a butcher knife to the smokehouse, took down a ham, and cut off as many slices as you needed. That's the way it was done. Now we walk over to the Gregg-Cable House. The reason why it has both names is because a certain Lawson Gregg bought an acre of land from John P. Cable in 1879 and built a small house on it with lumber sawed at the mill. He later enlarged the house from time to time. He and his family lived on it and operated a store on the first floor. It is believed to be the first all-frame house in the Cove. Then in 1887, Rebecca Cable and her brother Dan bought the house and the acre their father had sold to Gregg 8 years earlier. They operated the store for about 8 years, after which they used the building as a residence and boarding house. Dan and his wife fell ill, and Becky stepped in and reared her brother's children, ran the boarding house, took care of the farm and cattle raising chores. She owned more than 600 acres of land and lived a long and successful life. She died in 1940 at the age of 96. After her death, the house was moved from its original site on the Forge Creek Road to the location it is standing today. This cool-looking structure is a corn crib used for the storage of corn, which was the most important crop in the Cove. People ground it into meal for making bread, and for some of them to make moonshine. The overhanging sides could be used for the storage of farm equipment. This type of barn with the drive-through in the center and the stalls on each side was more typical in East Tennessee than the cantilever barn. Two men with pitchforks, one on a wagon load of hay in the drive-through and the other in the loft, could transfer the hay to the loft in a short time. The hay was fed to draft animals and milk cows during the winter months when grass in the fields was poor. The drive-through sometimes served as a storage for farm equipment. An old sorghum mill being shown here, made back in the 1800s, which is not used anymore, and it was made for making molasses, which was often a social event here. A modern reenactment is right next to it, which shows the sorghum cane stalks that were cut down in the fall, stripped of their leaves, then run through the rollers of the mill, powered by a horse or mule pulling a long pole in a circle. The rollers pressed out the cane juice, which was boiled down into molasses in a nearby furnace. You could buy these jars anywhere in this park and at the visitor centers. We now resume the auto tour. Next stop is Whitehead Place. When Matilda was abandoned by her husband and left with her child, her brother hastily built a small log cabin for them. At the same time, or shortly after, Henry Whitehead's wife died, leaving him with 3 daughters to rear. Henry courted and married Matilda. He built for them the larger house of square-sawed logs, the log sections of 4 inches thick, enough to provide plenty of insulation. At first glance, the building looks like a frame house, until you notice the jointed corners. Some call it a transition house, a link between regular log houses and frame houses built of sawed lumber. It was one of 3 such houses in Cades Cove, and it is the only one left in the park. Sawed log houses were not built until sawmills came to the cove. This pair of buildings represents the roughest and finest of log construction in the Smokies. We now go to Dan Lawson's place. Dan Lawson built this house in 1856 on land bought from his father-in-law Peter Cable, whose home stood to the west across the stream. The brick chimney, unusual for this time and locale, was built of bricks made on site. Lawson owned a swath of land starting at the Tennessee-North Carolina line on the mountain crest to the south and coming down the mountain and across the cove and north to the top of Cades Cove Mountain. The original house of hewn logs was built before sawmills came to the cove, but at examining, it shows that sawed lumber later was used in additions and maintenance. The small building closest to the house is a granary, and the other is a smokehouse. This barn was built much later on this property, more like towards the turn of the century. Now go to Tipton's place. Colonel Hamp Tipton, who served in the Mexican War, owned property in Cades Cove, but lived in Tucalichi Cove. He had this house built in the early 1870s. Among those who lived in it were his daughters, Miss Lucy and Miss Lizzie, who taught school in the Cove, and James Macaulay family. The Macaulays rented the place briefly in the late 1870s before James bought land and built his own home, plus blacksmith and carpenter shops. This is a huge attic compared to the log cabin's attics, one of the advantages of frame construction. The long shed on the opposite side of the house sheltered bee gums. A close-up of the bee gum overhang. A smokehouse and a wood shed are in the front yard. The blacksmith shop James used here stands nearby in the hollow. That chimney is amazing. On the other side of the road stands a double-open corn crib. Enter the barn area and a cantilever barn, a replica of an earlier one in the same place. we go to Carter Shields' cabin. A wound suffered in the Battle of Shiloh left George Washington Carter Shields crippled for life. Shortly after the war, he married and moved to Kansas. He returned to Cades Cove in 1906 and bought this property in 1910. One would think that an older soldier could find contentment in such a lovely nook. But Shields lived here only for 11 years before leaving again. This place is another great example of frame housing. You can see all the boards that frame the attic and makes it very livable. Carter Shields is the last of our places of interest here in Cades Cove. But we do have one more stop. At the ranger station and the visitor center, look at the store for souvenirs and use their restrooms. There's also a campground right behind this place. Really nice. Plenty of wood for the campfire. Here you can buy any kind of souvenirs to remember this place. Bring back some memories with you. For most of its history, Cades Cove has been a place to visit, but for more than 100 years it also was a great place to live. We really enjoyed Cades Cove, and hopefully you enjoyed watching it. Thanks for coming along, and you all have a great day.